EDHEC is launching a new tool based on Bayesian Nets for stress testing, portfolio management and scenario analysis. I would like to explain, first of all, why it's useful, which investment problems it helps solving, and of course, what it is and how it works. As for the features of this tool, it will be publicly available and regularly updated. Initially, it will be in a static environment with prepared scenarios and limited interactivity, but we are planning further developments in which there will be interactive updating of scenario configurations, the ability to carry out sensitivity analysis, and the ability to build new scenarios. What problems we want to solve? What are the problems we are trying to solve? First of all, there is scenario analysis and stress testing from a point of view of risk management. Berkowitz wrote a famous paper in which said that stress testing is in a purgatorial state. It is the poor relation of other risk measures. It produces some scary numbers, some scary loss numbers, but it doesn't then answer the question, should we worry? Because typically, a stress testing program does not provide a probabilistic assessment of the occurrence of these scary events. And furthermore, there is what is called the uncertainty principle of risk management, which very imprecisely and roughly speaking goes something like this. If you tell me the probability of something happening, it is extremely difficult for me to say what combination of events has given rise to this loss. Conversely, if you tell me which configuration of events have given rise to this loss, it's very difficult to assign a probability to it. And this goes to the heart of the difference between frequentist and subjective probabilities. Frequentist probabilities are those that we can estimate by counting past occurrences that have occurred in the past. Subjective are probabilities such as what is the likelihood of the next president of the United States being a Democrat or a Republican. Arguably, from the point of view of stress testing and, as I will argue, portfolio management, both types of probabilities are important. And the other area of obvious application is asset allocation. We need a coherent approach to asset allocation in the presence of stress events. Asset allocation strongly relies on portfolio diversification, but the correlation that we estimate in normal times can be very, very different from the correlation that will prevail in a situation of stress. And furthermore, we would like to obtain portfolio weights that remain stable under a wide variety of conditions. There are, of course, several approaches to stress testing. One approach is quite popular. It is looking further out in the tails, extreme value theory and the like. Unfortunately, it has very little traction with senior decision makers and portfolio managers. Again, it goes back to the uncertainty principle of risk measure. It is extremely difficult to understand what gives rise to these enormous losses. Typically, these are the ultimate black boxes, and black boxes, and rightly so, are becoming less and less popular in risk management and portfolio management. The other approach is a vulnerability-driven stress testing. In that case, one looks at one's portfolio, one realizes a particular vulnerability and stresses this vulnerability by a large amount. However, suppose that my vulnerability is, say, to inflation. Is inflation going up because the economy is working extremely well, is working at full cylinder, or is inflation going up because, for instance, the currency has weakened and it is a case of imported inflation? Clearly, what is happening to my other asset classes that could be offset or reinforce the losses coming from the vulnerability can be very different. So what is much more desirable is to have coherent causal scenario. In this, the attempt is made to link all the main risk factors of a portfolio into a coherent narrative. In this way, offsets and positive feedbacks can be taken into account, and they can be logically coherent but intuitionally appealing. So we would like a coherent scenario. How can we achieve this? Bayesian Nets offer a very intuitive and very powerful way to construct coherent scenarios. How do they work? What are Bayesian nets? A formal definition would point to directed acyclical graphs equipped with probability tables. But this definition doesn't take us very far. Let's have a very simple example instead. And the simplest example I can think of goes to John, who's error-prone, who has a tendency of slipping when the pavement is wet. And the pavement can be wet for two reasons, either because it has rained or because the sprinkler is on. Now, the intuition behind Bayesian nets, and which is encoded in conditional independence, is that once I know whether the pavement is wet or dry, I don't need to know anymore whether it is dry because or wet because of a sprinkler or because of rain. I only need to specify the probability of John slipping given the wetness or dryness of a pavement. Moving from this stylized example to something vaguely more relevant from the point of view of financial and economic analysis, let's think of assessing the probability of a monetary authority having a hawkish policy. Well, if a monetary authority is only informed by the status of inflation, then there are two causal links, the strength of the economy and the strength of a currency, that feed into the inflation. And therefore, we can say that once I know inflation, I don't need to know anything else in order to determine whether the monetary authority will be hawkish or dovish. But it could very well be the case that the monetary authorities are also informed by the strength of the economy. And with the Bayesian net, it is very easy to incorporate this different piece of information by introducing a causal link straight from the strong economy to the monetary policy. So why are Bayesian nets useful for scenario analysis? We have taken a sneak preview to understand what they are, but they have very many positive features. They're intuitive. And despite being intuitive, they are logically coherent, and they give a coherent description of a complex scenario. They ensure consistency amongst the variables that appear in the scenario, and they produce the consequences of a scenario in a transparent and understandable manner. Transparent and understandable means that a senior decision maker who is intelligent but not necessarily mathematically well versed can challenge the results and ask what-if questions. And they can be used to overlay the tails from a given scenario on top of the business as usual joint distribution. So what do I need to specify a Bayesian net? It's quite simple. I need a number of variables, a number of states for each variable, a conditional probability table that specifies the probability of a child's node given the parent's nodes only, so the probability of John sleeping only given the parent of the pavement being wet, and a causal link among the variables encoded in directed arrows. So what are the variables in a Bayesian net? The variables in a Bayesian net are the roots, the transmission channels, and the leaves. The roots are the prime causes of a scenario. For instance, Italy undergoes a disorderly default. The intermediate nodes, the transmission channels, is what happens as a consequence of this. For instance, the failure of a bank or the intervention of the ECB. And the leaves are the ultimate effects, that is to say, the changes in the market risk factor, for instance, in treasury yields, in corporate spreads, or on the exchange rate. As I said, conditional probabilities are an essential ingredient of this approach. Where do they come from? They can be implied from market quantities, they be provided by subjective inputs, and they can be obtained by statistical analysis. It must be stressed that the subjective component is crucial, but this is unavoidable when we analyze a scenario. This is a semi-realistic example. I have the case of a hard Brexit as my root event. So the exit of Great Britain from the European Union can either go down a soft or a hard route. Whether it is soft or hard, it will affect sterling, it will affect inflation, it will affect trade, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of a UK portfolio manager who has under her watch an equity portfolio a long-dated and short-dated gilt portfolio, and a portfolio of linkers. And here are a number of transmission channels that link the root event with a portfolio of interest. This is a slide for people who like numbers, but what I would like to draw the attention to, we can obtain from here the, for instance, most likely configuration of events. And the useful thing that one can do for this is to check the plausibility of the output of a scenario. In this case, for instance, the most plausible scenario ends up being that we don't have a hard Brexit, therefore sterling does not weaken. Inflation remains low because sterling has not weakened. However, trade conditions are poor because of Brexit itself, GDP remains weak, and there is no need for a hawkish monetary stance. Given the weakness in the growth, there is QE in the UK. We can agree and disagree with this analysis. By analysis, I mean with assigning the highest probability to this scenario, but if we don't, it simply means we should reconfigure our Bayesian net in a way which is consistent with our understanding. Finally, focusing on the assets, the transmission channels transmit the probabilities down to the assets, and here we have, remember, the assets were equity holdings, long-dated and short-dated nominal yields and real yields. And we see that the outcome of this stylized example is that the highest probability event, we have that yields are down both at the long end and the short end, and real yields are up, and there is a bad state for the equity market. We notice by combining these two scenarios here, we have the same configuration for yields, but a different outcome for the equity market. Together, these two events almost make up 25% of the total probability mass. Again, we can interrogate the Bayesian net, we can interrogate the scenario, and we can ask ourselves whether this makes sense. And of course, probabilities are assigned also to less likely events. Very important as well, one can do sensitivity analysis. One can perturb any of the inputs and look very, very easily at what is the effect of this perturbation on the final losses and the final probability. And clearly, providing the subjective probabilities is not easy, but there are many tools and many tricks of a trade to provide cognitive help in filling the conditional probability tables. And the important things to stress is I believe that what we are left with at the moment are not fundamental problems, but they are what I call engineering problems, plumbing problems. I think that the conceptual case for a coherent stress testing has been won. There are several issues still remaining. I refer to the dimensionality problem, the consistency problem, and the propagation problem in some work that I've recently done. But all these problems, like the vast majority of engineering problems, are solvable, and I think that this is a fruitful and exciting area of analysis, and that is why, again, EDHEC is presenting and making public the stress testing tool.